The valley announced itself by smell before it revealed itself by sight. Nell Sievert came over the last ridge on a mule she had purchased in Boise for $11 and caught the faint, sharp tang of sulfur riding the October wind, a mineral breath rising from the earth itself, warm and ancient and unmistakable to anyone who had spent years working with fired clay and ATT minerals. She had grown up in her father's brick works on the southern edge of St. Louis, where the kilns ran from March through November, and the clay pits along the river produced the drainage tiles and sewer pipes that kept the growing city's foundations dry, and she recognized the scent of heated mineral water, the way a blacksmith recognizes the smell of quenched iron. It was the smell of the earth's own furnace venting through cracks in the surface. And when she crested that final ridge and looked down into the narrow mountain valley that the territorial maps called Sulfur Creek, she understood immediately that something extraordinary was happening beneath the frozen ground. The settlement sat in the valley's middle, perhaps 60 structures scattered along both banks of the creek, most of them rough log cabins with mud chinking and sod roofs already sagging under the weight of early autumn rain. A stamping mill stood at the northern end where a silver claim had been filed 3 years earlier, and the rhythmic thud of its machinery carried up the slopes like a slow heartbeat. But Nell's attention was not on the settlement or the mill or the scattered figures moving between the cabins below. It was on the column of steam rising from a rocky outcrop on the eastern slope, half a mile above the nearest cabin, where the hot spring emerged from a fissure in the volcanic basalt and poured its scalding water down a mineral-stained channel toward the creek below. The steam rose 30 feet in the cool October air before dissolving, a constant white plume that never wavered, never diminished, never paused. She sat on the mule and watched it for a long time, her surveyor's eye measuring the slope between that plume and the flat bench of land below where she intended to build, calculating the grade the way her father had taught her to calculate the pitch of drainage runs in St. Louis. By eye first, by instrument second, and by instinct always. Heinrich Sievert had been a man of clay. He had come from Saxony with the knowledge of ceramic manufacture embedded in his hands and his memory, and he had built a business in St. Louis, making the unglamorous but essential infrastructure that a growing American city required: 4-inch drainage tiles, 6-inch sewer pipes, 12-inch culvert sections, all formed on wheels and fired in beehive kilns that consumed cords of Missouri hardwood and produced pipe that would outlast the men who laid it in the ground. Nell had worked beside him from the time she was old enough to center a mass of raw clay on the spinning wheel, and by the time she was 20, she could throw a 2-foot pipe section with walls of uniform 3/8-inch thickness in under 4 minutes. She understood clay not as dirt to be tolerated, but as engineered material, a substance that, when properly formed and properly fired, became as durable as quarried stone and as waterproof as poured glass. When Heinrich passed quietly in his sleep during the winter of 1878, his lungs finally surrendering to decades of kiln dust, the business had already been declining for years as cast iron replaced ceramic in the municipal contracts, and Nell had sold everything, the kilns and the clay rights and the riverside property, for enough money to outfit herself for the Western Territories and file a homestead claim on land she had never seen but had chosen with considerable deliberation. She had selected Sulfur Creek from the Territorial Land Office listings because the description mentioned volcanic geology and mineral springs, and because the available parcels sat on a gentle slope between the hot spring and the valley floor. Within a week of her arrival, she had walked the ground between the spring and her chosen cabin site, driving wooden stakes every 50 feet and sighting along them with a brass hand level she had carried from St. Louis in a leather case lined with wool. The grade was consistent, approximately 1 foot of drop for every 65 feet of horizontal distance, a ratio that would move water through a 4-inch pipe at a reliable flow rate without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. The spring itself emerged at a temperature she estimated at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, based on the behavior of the water in the natural basin. Too hot to hold a hand in for more than a few seconds, but not at a rolling boil. The flow was substantial, perhaps 20 gallons per minute, pouring continuously from the basalt fissure, with the steady pressure of a source that drew from deep geothermal reserves far below the surface. The mineral deposits on the surrounding rock suggested it had been flowing for centuries at minimum. It would not stop in her lifetime or in any lifetime she could imagine. Sheriff Garland Pratt found her at the spring on her 3rd morning of surveying. He rode up on a bay gelding with a deputy trailing behind on a smaller horse and sat in the saddle looking down at her with the expression of a man who had already decided what he would say before he arrived. He was perhaps 45, thick through the chest and shoulders, wearing a canvas coat with a tin star pinned to the lapel that caught the weak autumn light, and he informed her that the hot spring sat on public land held in trust for the settlement, and that no individual could claim exclusive use of its waters. He delivered this pronouncement with the careful formality of a man who had memorized a legal phrase without entirely understanding the statute behind it, and he waited for her response with his hands crossed over the saddle horn and his chin lifted to a slight angle that conveyed authority. Nell told him she had no intention of claiming the spring or its waters. She was not building a dam or constructing a diversion or establishing a bathhouse or any other commercial enterprise. She was simply going to run a clay pipe from the overflow channel, water that was already flowing downhill and draining uselessly into the creek beneath the surface of her own legally filed homestead, claimed to her own cabin. She was not taking the spring. She was borrowing what the spring was already discarding. Pratt studied her for a long moment with that expression men wore when they were deciding whether a woman was worth the effort of further argument, then told her that any infrastructure connected to the public spring would require his explicit approval, and that such approval would not be forthcoming until she could demonstrate that her project did not interfere with future development of the resource. He pronounced the word development with a deliberate emphasis that revealed exactly what kind of development he had in mind, and Nell learned that same afternoon from a woman named Delia at the general store that Pratt's brother-in-law, a man called Virgil Lott, who lived in Boise and visited quarterly, had been talking for 2 years about building a commercial bathhouse at the spring and charging miners $1 per soak. She began digging the trench the following Monday. The work was brutal and solitary, and it consumed the better part of 5 months. 2,600 feet of trench, 30 inches deep, cut through Rocky Mountain soil with a pickaxe and a flat-bladed spade, and the stubborn physical endurance of a woman who had spent her early years hauling 60-pound sacks of clay from the river pit to the workshop floor. She worked from first light until her arms could no longer lift the pick above her shoulders, and then she switched to the pipes. She had located a deposit of suitable clay along the creek bank a mile south, a dense, fine-grained alluvial clay with lowite content that would fire to a hard vitrified surface, capable of withstanding both the thermal stress of continuous hot water flow and the mechanical stress of 30 inches of overburden pressing down on it through decades of seasonal freeze and thaw. She built a potter's wheel from a salvaged wagon hub and a flat pine board, and she constructed a pit kiln from fieldstone and river clay, lining it with fire brick she had purchased in Boise and freighted in by wagon at significant expense. Each pipe segment was 4 inches in interior diameter, roughly 6 inches in exterior diameter, including the walls, and 24 inches long. One end was flared slightly to accept the narrow end of the next segment, creating a socket joint that could be sealed and made permanently watertight. She threw them on the wheel in the manner her father had drilled into her since she was old enough to work, centering the clay with her palms, opening the mass with her thumbs, pulling the walls up to uniform thickness with steady pressure, then shaping the socket flare on one end and the spigot taper on the other. Each segment required 6 minutes on the wheel and 2 full days of gradual drying in the shade before it was ready for the kiln. The kiln held 18 segments per firing, and each firing consumed a full cord of pine and required 36 hours of careful temperature management. Building the heat slowly over 12 hours, holding it at vitrification temperature for 8, then cooling gradually over 16 to prevent thermal cracking. She fired the kiln every 5 days and produced roughly 15 usable segments per cycle, the remainder lost to hairline cracks or slight warping that compromised their structural integrity. She needed 1,300 segments to cover the 2,600 feet from spring to cabin. At 15 per firing, she needed 87 firings, which at one firing every 5 days would take over 14 months. She could not afford that timeline. She began firing twice per cycle, one batch drying while another fired, working the wheel between kiln tending sessions, sleeping in 3-hour intervals beside the glowing kiln so she could monitor the temperature by the color of the fire visible through the draft holes. She cut her production time to 7 months and manufactured 1,400 segments, banking the extra 100 as replacements for any that might crack during installation or service. The joint sealing was the most critical operation in the entire system. Each socket joint, where the spigot end of one segment nested into the flared end of the next, had to be absolutely watertight under the continuous pressure of flowing geothermal water. She mixed pine pitch with lime putty in a ratio her father had developed through decades of municipal sewer work in St. Louis, and she packed this compound into the annular space around each connection with a wooden caulking tool she had carved herself, pressing the mixture firm and smooth until no gap remained visible. Then she wrapped each joint with 3 turns of oiled burlap, pressing the fabric into the still soft compound to create a flexible waterproof bandage that would accommodate the slight thermal expansion and contraction of the clay as hot water flowed and the surrounding earth temperature changed through the seasons. Each joint required 15 minutes of precise handwork, 1,300 joints. Over 300 hours of sealing performed on her hands and knees in a 30-inch trench that smelled of raw earth and pine resin and sulfur. Before burial, she bedded each section of pipe in a 4-inch layer of dry straw purchased from a rancher in the adjacent valley. The straw served as thermal insulation, an additional barrier between the warm pipe and the cold surrounding earth that would help the water retain its temperature across the long half-mile journey from source to destination. She laid straw in the bottom of the trench, set the connected pipe on top, packed straw carefully around the sides and over the crown, then backfilled with loose earth, tamping gently to avoid stressing the fired clay beneath. Deputy Asa Weil sat on a flat rock above the trench for 3 weeks in August on Pratt's orders, ostensibly monitoring for permit violations. He told Nell on 2 separate occasions that the sheriff could issue a formal cease order at any time and compel her to halt construction. She told him that she was performing manual labor on her own legally deeded homestead claim, and that the sheriff's jurisdiction over her private ground extended precisely as far as the written law allowed, which, in an unincorporated Idaho Territory settlement, was essentially nowhere at all. Weil was a young man of perhaps 22, with no particular malice in him, and after the 3rd week, he simply stopped appearing. On the 4th of November, 1880, Nell opened the upstream connection. She had built a small stone headbox at the spring's overflow channel, a collection basin that funneled the emerging hot water into the mouth of the first pipe segment, and she had mortared a flat stone across the opening as a temporary dam while she completed the downstream work. That morning, with the cabin's underfloor serpentine fully connected and the discharge pipe exiting through the far foundation wall into a stone-lined drainage ditch, she climbed the half-mile to the spring and pried the sealing stone free with a short iron bar. Nothing happened immediately, and she had expected nothing. 2,600 feet of 4-inch pipe held approximately 270 gallons of trapped air that had to be displaced by the incoming water before flow would appear at the far end. At the rate determined by the pipe diameter and available head pressure from the 40-foot elevation difference, complete displacement would require between 3 and 4 hours. She walked back down to the cabin and sat on the step and waited. At 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the discharge pipe began to make sounds. First, a low gurgling, the sound of air being pushed ahead of advancing water through a narrow clay tube. Then a cough of turbulent air and sediment-clouded water. Then a thin but steady stream that poured from the opening into the drainage ditch and was, when she held her cupped hand beneath it, warm. Not scalding, not the 140 degrees of the source, but unmistakably warm, perhaps 110 degrees, the temperature of a comfortable bath, the temperature of water that had traveled half a mile through insulated buried clay pipe, and arrived still carrying the ancient heat of the earth in its substance. She went inside and knelt on the plank floor and placed both palms flat against the pine boards. For several minutes she felt nothing but cold wood. Then, so gradually that she could not identify the precise instant it began, the boards beneath her hands grew warm. The serpentine beneath the floor, 5 parallel passes of clay pipe running the full width of the cabin, roughly 80 feet of continuous pipe, radiating 110 degrees of geothermal heat upward through 6 inches of packed earth and 1 inch of pine plank, was performing exactly as she had designed. The heat rose through the floor the way it rises through a kiln wall, steady and pervasive and completely silent. And within an hour, the cabin's interior air temperature had climbed from the ambient 44 degrees of a November afternoon to 55 degrees, and it continued rising. She adjusted the wooden gate valve she had installed where the main supply pipe entered through the foundation, a simple plank and groove mechanism that could restrict or fully close the flow, and found that at half open the system stabilized with a floor temperature comfortable to stand on in stocking feet, and an air temperature near 60 degrees. Full open pushed the floor toward uncomfortably warm, and the air past 65. She settled on 3/4 open as the ideal autumn setting, knowing she would run it fully open when the deep cold of January arrived. That evening she did not light the iron stove for warmth. She lit it briefly to boil water for coffee and fry a pan of salt pork, then let the fire die completely. The cabin stayed warm. The floor radiated its constant gentle heat, and the log walls, no longer losing their stored warmth to frigid interior air, began functioning as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. She sat in the warm, quiet cabin and listened. The silence was the most remarkable thing. No crackle of burning wood. No draft whistling through the stovepipe damper. No need to rise in the dark hours to feed logs into the firebox. Just the warmth of the earth itself, conducted through clay, carried by water, delivered through pine, filling the room with heat that had no visible source and required no fuel she would ever need to cut or haul or purchase. The neighbors noticed within days. A smokeless chimney in Sulfur Creek during November was as conspicuous as a gunshot in a quiet room. Every other cabin in the settlement trailed a constant gray plume from its stovepipe, the visible proof of firewood being consumed at the steady rate that winter demanded. And the absence of smoke from Nell's chimney drew attention the way a missing tooth draws the tongue. Martha Riddle, who lived 300 yards down the slope and whose husband worked the stamp mill, came by on the third smokeless morning to ask whether Nell had run out of firewood and needed assistance. Nell told her the cabin was heated by water from the hot spring, piped underground through clay. Martha stood in the doorway and felt the warmth emanating from the interior, and looked at the unlit stove, and looked at the floor, and looked back at Nell with the careful expression of someone receiving information that was technically comprehensible, but practically unbelievable, the expression of a person whose understanding of winter and the fundamental relationship between fire and warmth had just been quietly contradicted by evidence she could feel through the soles of her boots. She walked away without further comment, but she told her husband that evening, and her husband told the men at the stamp mill, and within a week the settlement knew something inexplicable was happening inside Nell Sievert's cabin. Pratt rode past the cabin twice in late November, each time noting the cold stovepipe with visible irritation. He told men at the general store that the pipe arrangement was a novelty that would fail catastrophically the moment real winter arrived. Clay pipe buried in frozen mountain ground, carrying scalding water from a sulfur spring. The joints would crack, the clay would split, the water would lose all its heat over half a mile and arrive as cold and useless as creek water. He predicted complete system failure before Christmas and expressed satisfaction in that prediction with a confidence that suggested he needed it to be true for reasons that extended well beyond engineering. The cold arrived on the 9th of December, and it did not leave for 12 days. It came not gradually, but with the sudden authority of a door slamming shut. One evening, the temperature was 15 above zero and manageable, and by dawn it had fallen past zero, past -10, past -15, and was still dropping with the relentless momentum of something that intended to reach the floor of what the atmosphere could produce at this latitude and altitude. The temperature dropped to -20 on the first night, continued falling through the second day, reached -35 by the third afternoon, and held there with the grinding mechanical persistence of a high-pressure system that had settled over the northern Rockies like an iron lid pressed down upon the earth. The wind was steady from the northwest at 15 miles per hour, not violent but relentless, driving the effective temperature to levels that froze standing water solid in under an hour and made the walk from cabin to privy an act requiring deliberate courage. The sky was colorless by day, a pale sheet stretched tight from horizon to horizon, and at night the stars appeared with a clarity so sharp and cold they seemed to be made of ice themselves. By the fourth day, the settlement's firewood supply had become a crisis. Most families had stacked what they believed was adequate, 4 or 5 cords beside each cabin. But the ferocity of this cold consumed fuel at double the normal rate. Stoves that usually burned through a quarter cord per week were devouring half a cord or more, and the men who would normally have been cutting and hauling fresh timber from the forested slopes found that the deep snow and lethal temperatures made sustained outdoor labor impossible. The communal woodlot, a shared reserve maintained through collective autumn effort, was being drawn down at a rate that arithmetic made terrifying. On the 6th day, 2 families began burning furniture. On the 8th day, a man named Colquitt froze the fingers of his left hand while attempting to fell a standing pine on the upper slope and returned to the settlement unable to grip an axe or a saw. The community gathered in the stamping mill's equipment shed, the largest enclosed structure, and 23 adults sat in the unheated space with their breath hanging in thick white clouds and discussed what would happen if the cold held another week. Nell attended the meeting. She walked the 300 yards from her warm cabin to the shed through air that felt like breathing ground glass, her wool scarf wrapped twice around her face, her boots crunching through snow compressed by cold into a surface as hard as packed stone. She sat in the very back of the shed on an overturned crate, and she did not speak. She did not need to. Everyone in the shed was aware that her cabin was warm, that her woodpile stood untouched at its full October height, that smoke had not risen from her chimney since the first week of November. The knowledge sat in the room alongside the cold, unaddressed, and unexplained, creating around her a silence that was different from the silence around anyone else. Not hostility exactly, but something adjacent to it. Incomprehension shading towards suspicion. Meanwhile, her clay pipe continued its work with mechanical patience beneath the frozen ground. The hot spring, its source buried in volcanic geology far below anything the surface weather could touch, produced water at 140 degrees regardless of what the air above was doing. The water entered the pipe and traveled the half-mile through straw-insulated clay buried 30 inches below grade, losing perhaps 30 degrees to the surrounding earth, and arrived beneath Nell's floor at 110 degrees, steady, continuous, inexhaustible. The pipe was never empty, never still, never subjected to the freeze-thaw cycling that destroyed static water systems. The constant flow kept the clay walls above freezing temperature along the entire run. Every one of the 1,300 joints, sealed with Heinrich Sievert's pitch and lime compound and wrapped in oiled burlap, held firm against the thermal gradients. Pratt came to her cabin on the 10th day of the cold snap. She saw him through the frost-edged window glass, walking, not riding, hunched against the northwest wind in a heavy buffalo coat, with the collar turned up past his ears, his boots punching through the crusted snow with each labored step. He had the posture of a man who had been cold for a long time, not just cold today, but cold for days and days, cold in the way that erodes will and judgment and pride simultaneously. He knocked on her door with a gloved hand, and she opened it and watched the heat from inside strike his face like something solid. A wall of warmth so total and so unexpected that he stood motionless on the threshold for several seconds, his eyes watering, the frost on his mustache beginning to thaw and drip onto his coat front. She stepped aside, and he entered. The interior was 62 degrees. The stove was not lit. No fire burned anywhere in the cabin. When he knelt at her direction and placed his bare palm flat against the plank floor, the warmth that rose through the wood into his frozen hand was steady and deep and pervasive. The warmth of stone that has been sitting in afternoon sun, a radiant heat that climbed through his knees and spread into his legs and reminded him of exactly how cold he had been for 10 consecutive days. She explained the system without triumph and without reproach. She described the pipe segments and the socket joints and the pitch and lime ceiling compound and the oiled burlap wrappings and the straw insulation bedding and the serpentine underfloor layout and the gate valve and the constant gravity-fed flow that prevented freezing. She told him about her father's pipeworks in St. Louis and the municipal sewer lines that had carried water beneath frozen Missouri streets for 2 decades without joint failure, because the principles of adequate burial depth and continuous flow and proper compound sealing were not mysterious, were not novel or magical or the product of feminine intuition, but were engineering knowledge developed through generations of careful practice and applied here with precision and patience and very hard physical work. Pratt listened with his hands held palm down over the warm floor. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he remained kneeling for a moment longer, absorbing through his skin the evidence that his prediction had been entirely wrong. Then he stood. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. But he asked a single question before he left, whether the spring's flow could support additional pipes to other cabins. And she told him that the spring produced far more water than a dozen households could use, that the engineering was not complicated, that anyone with access to clay and a kiln and the willingness to dig 2,600 feet of trench could build exactly what she had built. He nodded once and walked back out into the killing cold, and she watched through the window as he descended the slope toward the settlement, with his shoulders rounded against the wind and his buffalo coat pulled tight, carrying with him the knowledge that the resource he had spent a year trying to obstruct for his brother-in-law's commercial profit had the capacity to save every household in the valley from the disaster that was at that moment consuming their reserves and their furniture and their faith in their own preparedness. The cold broke on the 12th day. A warm front pushed in from the southwest, and the temperature rose 40 degrees in 18 hours, climbing from -30 to a comparatively merciful 8 above zero that felt, after what they had endured, like redemption itself. Heavy wet snow began to fall, and the settlement emerged from its cabins with the stunned relief of people who had not been entirely certain they would survive to see the thaw. Nell's pipe had not cracked, had not frozen, had not failed in any of the ways that prediction and common sense and Garland Pratt had insisted it would. The water continued to arrive at 110 degrees beneath her floor, and the floor continued to radiate its patient warmth, and the woodpile against her north wall stood at its full October height, untouched, unburned, unnecessary, while every other household in the settlement counted what remained of their diminished supply and calculated how many weeks of winter still lay ahead. By the following autumn, 3 families had begun digging their own trenches toward the hot spring. Nell helped each of them, calculating pipe quantities, demonstrating kiln construction and firing schedules, teaching the joint sealing method that Heinrich Sievert had perfected in Missouri and that his quiet, stubborn daughter had carried west in her memory like an inheritance more durable than money. She did not charge for the knowledge. The spring's water belonged to the mountain, she told them, and the knowledge of how to use it belonged to anyone willing to do the work of learning. Virgil Lott never built his bathhouse, The spring's overflow, once imagined as a commercial asset to be captured and monetized, had become instead a communal resource, distributed through clay, shared through honest labor, accessible to anyone willing to dig. The pipe Nell built, 1,300 segments of hand-thrown kiln-fired clay, joined at 1,300 sealed connections with pine-pitch-and-lime-putty, and wrapped in oiled burlap, buried 30 inches deep in a bed of dry straw along a half-mile trench she had dug alone with a pickaxe and a spade, continued to deliver the earth's heat to her cabin floor without interruption, without maintenance beyond occasional inspection, and without the burning of a single log for warmth, for as long as the spring flowed and the clay endured and the water remembered the patient downhill path to the woman who had understood what it was capable of becoming.